Okay. Yes, I'm Michelle. I'm the president, and we will begin. There's a sign-in link that will be in the chat, so keep an eye out for that. And there will be links to everything that I talk about in this presentation. A brief overview: SCB is an international professional organization. We do meetings about conservation and biological diversity, basically. And then we have our bi-weekly GBMs with speakers that talk about their research, and then a series of events and volunteering opportunities, which I will be talking about now, or in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to welcome our new officers. We have Debriana Love as our historian and Blair McQueen as our volunteer coordinator. They're both joining a little late due to some of their responsibilities that they're coming from, but they will be joining in a bit. Yeah, so I'll just introduce them briefly. This is Debriana, your new historian. She's a WEC major. She is interested in insects, frogs, large mammals, and plants, and she's excited to meet you all. And then we also have Blair McQueen. She's the volunteer coordinator. She's a WEC major and junior transfer student from Ocala, originally from Virginia, loves being outdoors, and she's also excited to meet everyone. And I'm really excited to be working with these two new officers as well as the rest of our team this semester. Yeah.
Here, so
okay.
Nice to meet everybody.
Yes. Would you like to say something else?
No, just nice to meet y'all. And if you have any questions or anything, any ideas, feel free to come to me.
Amazing. Yes, welcome. And then just an update on our themes. We're changing the mammal month to an insect-related month due to difficulty finding speakers. Someone say something? Okay, moving on. Review on our point system. We just need 3 GBM attendance and then 2 event points for active status. And then we have our perks over here, which is merch, the end of year trip, and then priority for officer roles for next year. But yeah, all of our events do count for an event, like that's a given. So then, yeah, be sure to attend them. And then we have a spreadsheet that you can check your points on to see where your status is. Once again, I am announcing the thing we're doing with TerraCycle, where we're collecting items that are not usually recycled for them to be upcycled or recycled into other items. And these are the categories of items that we'll be collecting once we're in person again, which will most likely be our next meeting. And then we have an exciting Valentine's Day fundraiser. This is the first kind of tabling fundraiser we're doing, so we're excited about that. We have 3 different days that will be in Turlington and selling items for people. So if you want to check this out and support us, the money will be going towards general club functioning as well as our end of year trip. So yes, please check us out. We'll be selling Valentine's themed bags that you can give to your friends and loved ones, and they include really cute wildlife related Valentine cards and then other goodies. So yeah, check us out. And then we have our upcoming events. This Saturday we have the Great Invader Raider Rally, which is an event where we go out to a site and pick out invasive plants from the area. And the registration will be closing soon. We'll be closing it tomorrow because we have to register by the 9th. And then we'll let everyone know what the site is after we register. And then we have Ashton, Biological Preserve volunteering. Kaylee, our event coordinator, will be talking a bit more about that.
Hello, friends. So that's actually supposed to be the 13th.
Oh, yeah.
Little mix up, but yeah, so it's going to be February 13th. That's this Sunday. It's going to be from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And we're essentially just going to be going up. We're going to be touring, and we're also going to be helping, like, moving some of, like, the fence posts for, like, their enclosures and stuff, and just helping out around the facility. Um, but something about, like, the carpooling, Ashton is there's basically, you have to take a 5-mile dirt road before you can actually get there. It's very, like, kind of nowhere, in the middle of nowhere. So what we're going to be doing is everything's on the sign up sheet, but we're going to be basically meeting somewhere, and then we're going to be basically condensing into, like, maybe like 1 or 2 cars, and then we're going to just drive up there in maybe like 1 or 2 cars. So there's not as much traffic on that road, and also your cars don't get completely a wreck, because I'm sure the dirt road is not going to be incredibly clean. Um, oh, another thing too, on Sunday, like, it's probably gonna rain. So if you do want to come, bring water, wear good shoes, and bring a rain jacket. And yeah, the sign up link should be in the chat. So, oh, let me know if you need a ride too. It's on the sheet, but yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Kaylee. Yeah. So we have 2 great volunteer events for those of you interested in volunteering points, and then, or just the volunteering opportunity in general. And then we have this next event that we got an email about from Conservation Florida. They're doing a thing called a Bio Blitz in Withlacoochee Gulf Preserve, which is an hour away from Gainesville. This is an announcement for an event in March, and yes, it's an interactive event where basically there's going to be staff from the organization just taking you around, and then you'll learn how to document the animals and plants that you come across. And yeah, you explore biodiversity, and then yeah, you'll get to learn about the wetland area. And yes, so they asked people who are interested to sign up individually on their website, so that this each person can fill out a waiver, and then so you can receive up-to-date information. And this day is the Saturday of spring break, so we're not sure if we want to organize like an official SCB trip there, but we have an interest form if you're interested in going, so we can gauge your interest ahead of time and then see what we can do about having a carpool situation going. So yeah, fill that out if you're interested. And then without further ado, please welcome our speaker. It is Paul Evans with the Croc Docs Lab. He is a science writer and outreach coordinator for the organization. He'll be talking about reptile conservation efforts in South Florida and non-native monitoring projects.
Hi. All right, let me pull that up real quick for you guys. So yes, my name is Paul Evans, and we are going to be going over some of those topics, as well as a couple of things that we do at Croc Docs, just kind of give you guys more of a in-depth kind of view of what we do here. So Croc Docs, we are stationed down near Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We are an ecological and biological research team working in South Florida as well as the Caribbean. A little bit about my background. I got my master's at the University of Aberdeen in the UK. I did undergrad at the University of South Florida. I have worked previously with Florida Aquarium, Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, Audubon Clearwater, Pinellas Counties, Keep America Beautiful, and a lot of my personal research goals here is with behavioral ecology, remote sensing applications, and community ecology. I did my master's on kind of looking at community ecology of gray seal haul-out sites. And now I work with reptiles. So a lot of the wildlife of interest that we were focused on here at Croc Docs are crocodilians. This will be alligators and crocodiles here in the States, as well as with invasive caiman that do pop up in some parts of the state. Caiman is more closely related to alligators and tends to be mostly smaller, but there are some subspecies in parts of Orinoco and Amazon that can be just as big as some alligators. Invasive lizards. So invasive lizards that we primarily work with will be tegus, iguanas, and monitor lizards. So here we have a tegu and a monitor lizard, both that have been trapped in some type of large reptile trap that we use, mostly in some of our monitoring programs. A lot of that also is led into invasive species and invasive snakes. So not all of those lizards are actually invasive yet. Not all of them have began establishment and actually started reproducing. But both of these main non-native constrictors that we deal with, being Burmese python and North African pythons, they have actually. So those are the ones we primarily do a lot of our research with. Then we get into just some of the Caribbean wildlife work that we do. So in Belize, we do a lot with the Hicatee. It's a critically endangered type of river turtle. It's actually the Central American river turtle. It's in some parts of South Mexico and parts of Guatemala, but mostly really parts of Belize are its last threshold in the world. And then we do have several camera traps over there where we do see things like jaguars and coatis. In terms of crocodiles and reptiles that we deal with in the Caribbean, a lot of that will be American crocs with some of the team in Jamaica, as well as morelets and American crocodiles in Belize. So those are just kind of some of the animals, some of the different taxons that we do a lot of work in. And these are more kind of breaking down into some of the project styles we do. Some of them are more for management and some of them are more for actual just kind of knowledge and discovery. So one of the main things we look at is pythons versus mammals. A lot of this has to do is not just pythons, but a lot of these non-native constrictors in parts of the world where they have started to kind of have a strong hold, like especially in the Everglades and many of the other counties, kind of as you start to move up the coast in Fort Lauderdale, Miami, some parts of even by Naples, we're starting to see an increase. And not all of this is always Burmese. Common boa constrictors also have a very good population. It's not expected that common boa constrictors are quite as established naturally, but due to their abundance in pet trade, they do pop up almost as much as Burmese python sightings, depending on the county. So with these types of surveys and these types of studies, it's using different camera traps to kind of see the presence and absence of different mammal species. A lot of this right now is done in Loxahatchee, as that's kind of the new frontier for where we're seeing a lot of large pythons start to kind of move towards. This is another big wildlife reserve here in parts of South Florida, where a lot of mammals, a lot of wading birds have had pretty strong populations. And unfortunately, we are starting to see that correlation that was saw in the early 2000s, as well as parts of the 2010s in the Everglades, where a lot of mammal populations and wading bird populations really declined quite sharply. And a lot of that has been linked to the presence of pythons, especially because of how pythons function. They go after mostly wading birds and mammals. Eye ramps. So this is a type of survey that we do basically every single night. It will be a different area usually, but this is done almost every single night of the week that we are out in the field. So this is the Everglades Invasive Reptile and Amphibian Monitoring Program. So this is essentially doing in-depth surveys to gather data on both native and non-native reptiles and amphibians in this part of the state. A lot of this is tied together with environmental and geographical data, kind of to further aid how the community as a whole is looking. So with a lot of these, it's really fun actually, because we get to see a bunch of the different native species that are here and doing well. But obviously we're also going to see things like cane toads. You're going to see Cuban tree frogs. You'll see all the different types of non-native and invasive geckos that are out there. And on occasion, we do see larger snakes like pythons, as well as actually you get some pretty fat cottonmouths out there. So one of the other kind of modeling processes that we do, that this tends to be kind of tied with a lot of our camera studies, is something called occupancy. So occupancy models are kind of trying to use a statistical model or statistical analysis to account for the imperfect detection of organisms in a survey. So kind of looking for the probability of what is the true presence or absence of a species in an area. If we could throw out any bias, if we can throw out any of those kind of things that may be throwing the equation, this is what we want to be using. So that way we can really try to quantify the detection probability of some of these species. Kind of as a visual, if we were to have one species and we have two cameras in this one area, we're trying to use this model to see how many of these species may be there and what is the likelihood that you would be able to come upon them or a trap would be successful there. And a lot of this is very helpful when it comes to species distribution. Species distribution is probably the main line of work outside of eradication/containment of non-native and invasive animals, because in many places they are moving to new parts of Florida they haven't been before, or they haven't been reported before. And those are important areas for us to kind of stop them from getting into, because in many of the areas where some of these species are currently, it's already a problem enough to contain them. We don't need more areas to try to figure out how to contain and eradicate them further. Ecological indicators. So a lot of this has to do with some of the conservation side, specifically with American crocodiles and American alligators. We use those two species to kind of track water and environmental restoration programs in parts of South Florida. A lot of this has to do with the rerouting of canals. There is a big sensitivity with both of those crocodilian species in water salinity, water depth, and habitat loss. So the dry and wet season that occurs here in Florida, that's very important, whether it has to do with the amount of salinity for hatchlings, whether it be crocs or alligators. Both of them are extremely sensitive to having too much salt in water, especially for crocodiles in the first 2 weeks, because they do not get their salt gland until roughly 12 to 14 days of being out of the egg. And then for habitat loss, a lot with the gators, they very much rely on the wet season to be able to spread out and give birth and nest and go through all of those processes. And when there's not enough of kind of those floodplains for them to distribute into during that time of the year, it really can mess up some of the population. So both of those are ongoing projects that have been going on for over 10 years in various different parts of the Everglades, parts of Big Cypress, many different water conservation areas, as well as through a lot of the Keys is where we are tracking all those different kind of numbers and different databases to all kind of come together to see how some different parts of this restoration is going. So these are some baby crocodiles. We do a lot of work with them specifically during the summer when crocs are hatched, and then in fall, particularly typically early fall. So think about September to maybe early October is when you would see something like caiman or alligators have their hatchlings. So a lot of this is being used to help better understand how Everglade restoration is working in this part of the state. If you guys look at that first picture, you can see that the Everglades and how water used to move through the state, it used to be very, very, very different. Unfortunately, now it has been pushed and water is distributed in very different ways. Some of that is due to canals. Some of that is due to where different farmlands, different large cities and industrial areas popped up. And the hope is to eventually reroute some of that bottom portion of water back into the Everglades so that it can kind of grow a bit more in terms of its water table and hopefully help out with some of the salinity problems in Florida Bay. So the Everglades, for those who don't know, is actually now less than half its original size. A lot of the environmental problems that are happening involve, of course, biodiversity. 68 species of plants and animals have now been considered threatened or endangered that happen to live within the Everglades. Many of those are endemic or are at the very least native to North America alone. Many wading bird numbers have dropped. Some of this has been linked to pythons, but the majority of these numbers here goes back to the 70s and the 80s, where more of the water restoration problems began. And that is definitely having a large impact on a lot of those types of birds, because obviously less water, less floodplains in some parts of the year, that's really going to mess with where they're able to nest, where they're able to kind of ecologically exist, as well as many recreational fish species have begun to die out. Some of this has to do with overfishing. Most of it is lost of, again, those floodplains. Floodplains are very important in this part of the state, just because they serve so much of a role ecologically for growing and expanding some of those aquatic environments during parts of the years where they're probably the most productive. As well as it doesn't help that a lot of non-native and invasive fish species, especially from the Amazon and parts of Africa, have been introduced as well. Because of the salinity that has been increased in many parts of Florida Bay due to less fresh water coming out of the Everglades over the last 50 years, we have seen a lot of the seagrass beds die almost completely, which is not good because it's a lot of environmental problems, not just due to the stability at a floor level, but as well as manatees and many other animals, especially different types of sea turtles and young sharks, young crocs, dolphins. All these animals really, really do rely on seagrass beds to have a different type of environment that they aren't going to find in other parts of the Gulf, that they kind of need within this area of the world. The UN now considers the Everglades one of the world's most endangered natural wonders, which is why about 30 years ago, a lot of new regulations, a lot of new kind of actual projects and funding went towards trying to reroute a lot of those waterways, which is why some of those roads down there are always under construction, because there's a lot of infrastructure that's being rerouted for the hopes of bettering the Everglades. So what is the purpose? Well, a lot of the research that we kind of do has similar aims or similar kind of goals from start to finish. A lot of it tends to be trying to understand non-native species and the distribution that exists there. Some of it's trying to quantify Everglades restoration efforts, whether that's through seeing populations increase for some of these native species, or whether it's simply removing a lot of those invasive and non-native animals. Some of it is tracking population growth, whether this is through different types of reptiles, amphibians, mammals. There's a whole different kind of category of ways we're able to track some of those populations, as well as trying to understand kind of lesser known or rarer species or some of those species behaviors. A lot of that tends to be more the work in Belize, but as well as with some of these animals here in the States, there definitely are some individuals of native species that are definitely rare in today's standards, that there's still a lot unknown because we are dealing with several environments that have been disturbed. There's still a lot to kind of see how they function now in a more predominantly human society, as well as it is then analyzing non-native species and their trophic impacts. So some of that has to do a lot with gut analysis. So in just a minute, we're kind of going to dive into more specifically just the non-native work. This was just kind of a nice review of what we do here at Croc Talks. And hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of insight of what kind of a lot of our goals are and why that ties into a lot of the non-native species we're going to talk about. So what is the problem specifically here in Florida? Well, a lot of the problems here in Florida, unfortunately, they go back many years. Some of the species that maybe are quite common in a lot of our mindsets here in the States are actually non-native species. Most of our lizard species are non-native species, those little northern curly tails, many different types of anoles. All of those lizards are not from here, and they have been here, some of them for 100 or so years. And at this point, obviously, eradicating some of those species it's null and void. There's not really a whole lot of point in doing it. But the problem over time is that, as you guys can see, the introduction has grown tremendously. In the last 5 years, we actually have, this number's gone up. It's not official, but the unofficial number, I believe, is 203 introductions. So this is 185 introductions, and out of that, roughly a third of them are established. So 63 of these species are breeding, reproducing, distributing, just kind of having a grand old time here in Florida. A lot of that has to do with our climate. A lot of that has to do with the fact that for many, many years, this was a big port area. It still is a big port area today, but with a lot of modern technology, it's less likely most of these introductions are accidental from simply stowaways, although it does still happen from time to time. But that is one of the main things that, especially with some of the Caribbean types of herpetofauna that popped up, specifically types of frogs or lizards, that's kind of how some of those introductions first occurred. But now in the modern age, a lot of them come from exotic pet trade. And this is also true for many different types of ornamental plants, as well as the parasites and insects that may be on them. A lot of them came through some type of trade, both legal or illegal. Several species now do have regulations, and there are different lists, like the prohibited list, as well as the injurious list. But some of those species that are most popular in pet trade do not actually get put on those lists. So the common boa constrictor and the ball python, due to their size, they're deemed by the state to not be as likely to be as problematic. In my opinion, I don't exactly believe that is the most true statement, as we probably have over 400 reports of either of those species within a year. So there's definitely a large amount of them. They aren't deemed to be breeding outside of anywhere besides Miami-Dade County, but definitely those are species that are of concern moving forward in kind of invasion ecology. So Florida has more non-native reptiles and amphibians than anywhere else in the world, more than Australia, more than any other places that you kind of have. And a lot of that, again, kind of goes back to the climate, as well as it goes back to the fact that they're just really able to outcompete a lot of our native species. There are actually more non-native lizards that are breeding rather than actual native Florida lizards. So if you see a lizard, I think it's like your odds are like there's it's like 2/3 of all lizards are not actually from Florida that you can see today. So pretty good odds that you're going to see a lizard. It's not actually from Florida. But again, so many of them have been here for so long that a lot of the times that is misconstrued in kind of today's society, as well as the two largest snake species here in Florida that are breeding and reproducing are invasive. So this graph is what we call the invasion curve. This is kind of a trend that occurs both ecologically as well as through kind of management and economically of sorts within an area. So you kind of have a certain period of time where you have prevention, you can get more things kind of figured out. A lot of countries, especially places like Australia, as well as some species in regards to Florida, have a lot of regulations put in place before really any introductions have or ever did occur. And a lot of that is to kind of help this process along. So eradication, containment, and resource protection and long-term management are kind of the three stages. A lot of that has to do with how much space they take up, as well as how much population is able to grow. So usually that tends to be over time, though it does not have to. With many species, especially something like the tegu, they kind of really accelerated the areas they were able to infest. So their time was much shorter to the point where it became a much bigger problem. And obviously over time, the more expensive it becomes. I think 3.5 million is what the state started to set aside just this year for just some of the Python projects. I don't believe that considers the amount that was divisioned for the private sector. So that's just kind of what FWC has to kind of give out to help with a lot of their Python problems. So as you can see, there's a lot of money nowadays going towards it, but many of these problems occurred long ago. A lot of the times why we try to encourage having more of these conversations is that the public awareness typically begins when the population's already at a point where eradication is not possible. Now, it does not mean it won't ever be possible, but it is at the point where typically containment is the only rational way to start approaching the problem. And then you're hoping in a couple of years, you're able to move forward to actually go to full eradication. So why do we care? Well, a lot of the times we care because we're dealing with invasive species that can be extremely harmful, mostly through what they eat. And a lot of that through what they eat has to do with what they're able to remove from the environment. A lot of these animals are much larger than a lot of the times anything we have here naturally, let alone some of the, we'll say, counterparts of their niche they're going to be competing against. Obviously, several of these lizard species aren't really going to be competing against our native lizards. I think our largest native lizard is like maybe a foot long. They don't get super, super long. But then you have a bunch of non-native and invasive lizards who can get to 5 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet. Obviously, animals like that are going to be trying to compete with more types of mammals or types of birds for actual resources. The problem is that this is starting to cause an ecosystem imbalance because we have so many large animals that are here that are invasive that the only way they're really removed is through people. So when that happens, a lot of resources are being taken away, where many of these native snakes, these native lizards, the way they function is more like a mesopredator. So they're able to be both prey and predator. And that means they can kind of get rid of sick animals, remove a bunch of rodent species, and then get taken out by a big heron. So then that heron can keep doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is removing some of these snakes. And the snake is able to keep removing all those smaller types of rodents, different types of birds. The problem becomes is that these guys become so large that what they end up starting to have to eat are some of the more endangered and very critical species. So that could be alligator, that could be, it's hypothesized potentially panthers, obviously deer. There's a lot of things that they're able to start eating that then it's going to put more pressure on some of those larger mammals that already have dwindling populations. And then obviously it's Florida. Tourism is always going to become a big problem, mostly because a lot of people don't want to go on airboats where they're going to see potentially a python. A lot of this has to do with the fact that not many people are super keen on large snakes, let alone large snakes eating the alligators they're trying to see or the birds they're trying to see. And that definitely can impact some parts of the state economically, as well as just how expensive it is to manage. The Everglades is, I think, like roughly a 6, or I guess the Everglades in the greater area around it is roughly a 1/6 of the state. So we're out trying to manage a place and you're dealing with so much space and so much space that's underdeveloped for good reason, but underdeveloped. So then it makes it a lot harder to really fully manage it properly, which kind of gets into how big is this problem? Now, this is a 17-foot python that was brought in by Croc in 2012. The largest python found in the state, I believe, is 18.5, I think 2 feet. So a big one, very large one. In November, we brought in a 17.5 foot. So definitely still some big ones out there. Unfortunately, there's probably ones that are even bigger that have not been found yet. So some more management challenges that we kind of have, and I was getting at with the underdeveloped, is that they're in some very remote and inaccessible habitats that make eradication really hard without just completely demolishing the Everglades. The population estimates, they vary pretty severely, so much so that we don't really talk about it specifically because there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. A lot of it probably changes semi-seasonally or throughout parts of the year. But the problem is that a lot of these guys are getting to the size where we're seeing distribution start to increase, and they're slowly kind of moving up parts of the state. Now I say slowly because we're talking like kind of parts of Broward into Miami Beach and into, West Palm Beach, and then parts of West Everglades kind of up slowly to Naples and then potentially up towards Tampa. But breeding populations in those areas have not really been confirmed. It just seems to be like some distribution is happening from the kind of greater Everglades area. One of the major problems is not just being the fact that you kind of have to be on an airboat and then remove them, which means you, one other person, maybe a third person if it's a very large animal, and then the large animal are about all you can fit on the boat. So then you come into the problems of, okay, how are we able to get so many out? If it took you an hour to get out, an hour to get back in, and then you try to go find more. It's kind of where a lot of the problems has, which is why a lot of the times where they are detected, it's not usually just out and about in the wild. It's typically on levees, roads, and canals. Kind of where human and urbanization meets nature is where it's best to kind of see them. People have found them in grocery stores, in backyards, in really busy roads, on really slow roads, undisturbed, disturbed roads, basically just about anywhere. Though it's not common to see them in saltwater, they do find if they have to for just a little bit, which obviously has grown some concerns with the Keys and all the endemic species that live in those little islands that definitely would have major problems if Burmese pythons really started to grow in population out there. So some of the tools we and many other organizations that we do a lot of work with kind of use to gauge these types of animals and kind of the distribution and other types of management is, for starters, eDNA. So environmental DNA tends to be used for trying to detect the presence of rare or even cryptic species. Here, it's mostly just used to try to figure out where these animals are moving. So since a lot of the animals that do happen to take up root here have some kind of a fascination with water, tends to be pretty easy to start trying to gather data in many freshwater sources. It's actually how they first started knowing that there were at least a few Burmese population kind of in parts of South Waxahachie, as well as some Nile monitors popping up in parts of Hillsborough County over at Tampa. So that's kind of just trying to see where they're going and where perhaps more surveys or more kind of in-depth work needs to be done. Some of the best in-depth work is detector dogs. This has been very helpful, specifically in the Keys. It's basically just a drug dog that goes out. It will sniff a live snake first. So typically those teams keep a snake just kind of as a specimen to have around, maybe give it a sock or something to curl up with for a day or two, and then they give it to the dog to kind of have as a tool to kind of sniff out these animals. And then obviously they have a handler and everyone else, and they go and they're able to remove usually quite a few snakes when they go and do those surveys. Scout snake projects, so this is kind of just telemetry, doing various types of radio tracking. And again, a lot of that is typically to see where they're going, but it's also really helpful for getting a breeding aggregation. So then they're able to remove several snakes at once. A lot of the times, especially here in the States, how they breed is one lucky female finds a big kind of burrow, maybe a giant hole in a tree, or perhaps just a big wattle of like dead grass. And she releases all her pheromones over a couple weeks or days. And then a bunch of males come and they just have this weird ball of an orgy. But when that happens, we can go and remove a lot of individuals at once, which is good because all those animals are able to reproduce, which then means we're targeting a lot of the things that are having the most impact. And then lastly, we have large reptile traps. So that's just usually kind of to see what's up. Typically we have remote cameras with them just in case something were to get in and maybe it was too big, so it didn't actually fit and then it gets stuck in the trap, or it didn't even try to go in the trap, but we at least know it's in the area. So Python contractors, this has been one of the most helpful tools in actually removing and really effectively getting out a lot of these animals. And a lot of that is because it's getting more eyes on the ground. A lot of what we've learned in invasive management and research is that you will never have enough eyes on the ground. These animals can be in many places that we're not going to be as researchers and managers. And a lot of that's because they're going to be in more disturbed or localized areas, such as people's house, people's backyard, people's neighborhoods. And if you don't live there, probably not going to know. So far, they have been able to eliminate over 20,000 feet of snake, which is over 6,000 snakes. A lot of this is done through South Florida Water Management District, which has a Python elimination program, as well as FWC's Python Action Team for removing invasive constrictors. So both of those do very similar types of work, just kind of different contractor groups. Money kind of goes from different places to kind of make those systems work. But it's all in the same kind of field for helping people remove these types of animals. And which is really important because the estimated probability of these animals is less than 0.05. So it's not great. They really are good at hiding, especially if they've had a big meal, they'll just go and curl up. And since really all they'll have to do is get fresh water every once in a while, they kind of can just chill out because there's a lot of fresh water in the interior of Florida. So some of the species of a kind of particular concern are the wood stork, key largo wood rat. Those have already been found in gut kind of analysis. So diet analysis, you cut open an animal, you go through its guts, and you see what maybe it ate. So in there, wood storks and key largo wood rats have already been found. And based on location, as well as behavior, it is unfortunately very likely that these animals have predated on American crocodile, Florida panther, and the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. American crocodile is mostly just because how easily large, like 15 plus feet pythons are able to predate on kind of subadult alligators. So the fact that American crocodiles tend to be a lot leaner until they get to full maturity just kind of seems like it would also be a pretty easy target. So identification and reporting. Since you guys are definitely out and about doing things based on all the volunteer work you guys have coming up, there's definitely some reporting tools that maybe be helpful to you guys. You may have heard of them before. If not, that's fine. It's more stuff to kind of just take with you guys as you move forward. So Burmese python. Burmese python, kind of the poster child of all invasives. They are invasive, which means they are both non-native and they are established. They have a dark arrowhead shape right on the top of their head, as well as they'll have a wedge underneath their eye and kind of right behind their eye. And then they're going to have these kind of more irregular blotches with a tan background, kind of looks like puzzle pieces or almost like a giraffe-like pattern, as well as, since a lot of times when these guys are found, it's also at night because they can be extremely active both at day and at night. When they are hit by light or a flashlight, they actually have more of a glossy appearance. They can be anywhere from roughly about 13, 12 feet is when we consider them to be an adult. So that's about 5 to 7 years in. And then upwards of 20 feet, realistically, just because those haven't been found yet doesn't mean they don't exist out there. And anywhere from 150 to about 200, maybe 250, depending on how large the animal is what they would be with a mostly empty stomach. Obviously, if it's eaten something quite large, it's going to be much heavier. So these guys, you can see, have been found everywhere, but mostly really down in parts of the Keys, just kind of up to Key Largo, and then as you move through all of the Everglades. So a lot of that is off Alligator Alley, off Main Park Road and Everglades Park, as well as some of the trails inside the park or the parks in those areas, obviously Big Cypress and many of those other larger wildlife restoration areas do exist there. And that's where a lot of the reports come in from. So it's about 50-50 on if a snake was found, with whether it was removed. So 6,104 have been removed as of 2020 through this service, and then verified sightings is 6,048. So verified means it was reported, it was sent into the system, and a wildlife biologist looked at it and was like, yep, okay, that's a python. And then unfortunately, it was not able to be captured. Now, some of that could be just misidentification of an actual individual, or sometimes it is just a civilian, sent in the report. And obviously, if it was really large, I don't blame them for not wanting to pick it up or deal with that themselves. And the snake got away. But as you guys can see, some of those reports, especially kind of right up almost where Coral Springs is where we're starting to see more kind of approach towards Loxahatchee, and then as well up on the west side of the state, kind of moving from Cape Coral along towards St. Petersburg and Tampa, is where they kind of are starting to slowly get a couple more numbers each year than we weren't used to getting. So North African pythons, they're also invasive. They're only invasive in Miami-Dade County. So you guys don't have to worry about that up in Gainesville. But these snakes are typically about 12 to 13 has been the average of what was found. But this last year, there were actually, I think 3 14-footers found in the same kind of area that they've been in, which is a little concerning because we hadn't seen really much of anything in a couple of years. They tend to have a lighter, more brown gray body color. And then instead of having pretty clear-cut puzzle pieces, they're going to have more dark blotches that kind of run together almost if it was watercolor. They're going to have both a light and a dark wedge that goes right underneath and behind the eye. And then since they are a larger non-native constrictor, they are going to have more of a glossy appearance. Now these guys, if you look at their tail, it kind of is curled up like a cinnabon, and that's actually a defensive behavior that really only North African pythons do. So they would curl it up and kind of shake it to a kind of distract an attacker. So that way it would have a chance to defend itself by potentially being able to counterattack after it went to get the kind of attacker went for the tail. This is where you guys can see they have a pretty dense population in this part of the state, but they have had a couple, like 1 or 2, again, pop up towards Cape Cable, but most of the times when there are some of these introductions that are so out far of where the breeding population is, it's unfortunately either someone had a breeding facility at their backyards, mostly illegally, and it's just an escapee, or someone tried to keep something as a pet, and whether they meant to let it go or whether it's completely accidental, that's usually what happens. So Argentine black and white tegus, these guys are established, and in some parts of the state, they would be considered invasive. So they are black and white patterned, but when they are green, when they are hatchlings, they have a green head. Kind of the problem with this type of lizard, as well as the kind of new wave of non-native lizards being different types of iguana, different types of monitors, and tegus, is that a lot of these animals tend to live longer. Now, typically iguanas and monitor lizards aren't going to quite live as long as maybe something like a tegu. Kind of depends on the species and the size of the animal. But tegus kind of breed like rabbits and they live for 20 years. So that's a big problem, especially because tegus are so popular now in the pet trade. A lot of state regulation goes back and forth on what they need to actually be doing with it. And they have breeding populations in parts of Miami-Dade, Charlotte, and Hillsborough. And the last animal we're going to talk about is the Nile monitor. So this guy is established in parts of Palm County, Hillsborough County, as well as, oddly enough, just the Homestead Air Force Base, not the rest of Homestead, just the Air Force Base as of right now. And they have more of an olive green, kind of black or dark gray body. And then they have these weird rows of yellow stripes that kind of have a pattern that's vaguely like a V, but it also kind of sometimes looks like a 5-year-old tried to draw a circle. They can be anywhere from 5 to 6 feet, possibly up to 7 feet, and their tail will be at roughly 1.5 times the length of their body. And that's because they're very semi-aquatic. They're one of the most aquatic lizards that is also terrestrial in the world. They love the water, and they're definitely going to be an impact on nests for birds, nests for crocs and alligators, and there's already pretty good evidence that unfortunately tegus are also. So where's some of this reporting, and if some things you guys, if you don't know, this is a service you guys can go ahead and do today. If you're not into reptiles, you're not into amphibians, that's fine. I've got one. It's just a really great tool. Also, if you just want to learn more, they have a bunch of distribution maps on there, depending on what you guys maybe want to learn more about. It's a great service. So I've got one. It's an interagency effort made by parts of the University of Florida, parts of Fish and Wildlife, parts of Florida Wildlife Commission, as well as the national park organizations. So it's a reporting network to kind of facilitate more data collection. It can be done through a phone with a smartphone app. It can be done online at edmaps.org, as well as through the hotline, which is 1-888. I've got one. Basically, you can go in and you can see there's many different species. There's tons of plants, insects, fish. And basically, this kind of service makes those maps that I just showed you. So this is a lot of where we put a lot of our data into. A lot of other government organizations, as well as just other research centers, put a lot of their information, especially in this part of the state, because you're able to pretty easily put photos, gather data, and this is all stuff people can just do. This is just a citizen scientist kind of platform. You can get the location, upload your photos straight from your phone, go into more details if you guys want, especially with dead animals. That's really helpful to kind of have more information out there, simply because some of actually the first introductions of some of these non-native lizards were from roadside hits. Someone hit something, but probably tossed it up to just being an iguana. And then someone kind of came along and reported it, and we found out, oh gosh, it was a crocodile monitor. So there's definitely things like that that's very helpful if you guys are trying to just get better at identification. It's a great app to have on your phone, just to kind of go through and see the different plants and animals that are having an impact here in Florida. So now it's time, if you guys have questions about anything we covered, anything you want me to repeat, now would be a great time. If not, though, thanks for having me.
I have one question just about the
Sure.
environmental DNA. Is it just samples of water and not the air or soil? Because I've heard that you can also collect eDNA through air or something.
I do believe, I haven't heard of air. I have heard of soil, but I'm sure it does exist for air. Here in Florida, obviously, water is just the easiest for us to use. I have not heard of air, but I wouldn't be surprised. But I do know soil eDNA does work, and that definitely does exist. But here, mostly, it's like Cayman monitors and Python is what they use. So a lot of it's just water, because that's kind of how we're tracking those individuals.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Of course.
I was interested. I don't know if I missed it, but what was the best way you guys were able to track them in that vast open landscape? Like, how are you able to find all those snakes? Like, what was the best method that you guys?
A lot of it is, truthfully, it's contractors. It's having just simply people who that's what they do, is kind of their job. They get paid by the state, they get paid by some private sectors, and they just kind of have a whole, we have to teach them, and other organizations teach them. We all kind of have the same database. We just typically are the people who actually compare the databases and put it together to kind of build these research reports. But a lot of that is just people who are willing to go out there at 4 a.m. and do what they need to do. Now, on some of our surveys, we are still out there at 4 a.m. Heads up if you aren't aware, a lot of work here in Florida happens between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., give and take. So a lot of it is just having more people out there at times of day where maybe animals are not used to seeing people, just kind of trying to catch them off guard. Obviously, detector dogs and telemetry is really helpful for finding more specific locations, but a lot of that's really only helpful when you're dealing with a couple individuals. In terms of just actually removing and finding, it's best just a lot of people in places snakes aren't used to seeing people and grabbing as much as you can.
Got it. It's a sneak attack method.
It is a sneak attack,
Thank
fully.
you.
Of course. All right, anything else? And it's okay if not. I try to be as detailed as I can. So
I think that's all, but thank you very much. This is a really interesting presentation.
of course, yeah. I tried to give you guys the best of both worlds for what we do, as well as the non-native management. Kind of help you guys. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm sorry, what?
Oh, I was just gonna ask one, like, if anyone's interested, like, how can they reach out if they
Oh, okay, yes. So I do believe we're supposed to have internships this summer. I do not know much more about that currently. I would say definitely check our website, which is just crocdocs, I think, .ufl.edu. But just type in the Croc Docs, it'll pop up. There definitely is supposed to be stuff this summer, as well as if some of you guys are graduating. Typically, we do a round of hiring once or twice a year. So this is some stuff that you're kind of interested. Or if you're just coming home for summer and you happen to live down here in this part of the state, we do volunteers, and volunteers do get to come out and help with some of the surveys. Just kind of depends on some of our scheduling, but definitely for some of our invasive surveys, it's usually pretty easy to get an extra person on them. So a lot of that's just depending on where you are. But yeah, if we do have internships this year, which we are, I believe, supposed to, will be posted. I don't know when, but obviously before summer. So just check the website. If I happen to know when more of that comes out, I will try to pass that on to you guys. But I mostly deal with wildlife research and not hiring. But yeah, honestly, good luck to all of you guys for what you guys are doing with your next steps.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. All right, thank you guys. All right, well, you guys have a great night. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.